The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at where your water comes from and the cost of bringing it to you. Then, who is responsible when lead-tainted water shows up in Ontario schools? That's ahead. Tonight on The Agenda. Water infrastructure, we're talking water mains, sewer systems, and treatment plants, are usually out of sight and out of mind. That is, until something goes wrong. Calgary and Montreal experienced substantial water main failures this year. Here in Ontario, Hamilton has redoubled its efforts to evaluate and improve its very old, very complex system to prevent more sewage spills. And there are many more examples of systems in the province that need upgrades or expansions. And what does all of this have to do with aggressive housing targets Ontario has introduced? Let's find out. We welcome in Brampton, Ontario, Keely Dedman, Commissioner of Public Works for the Region of Peel. And with us here in studio, Barbara Robinson, President of Norton Engineering, Inc., also known as the Sewer Lady. Nick Winters, Director of Hamilton Water, and Michelle Grenier, Manager of Operations for the Ontario Waterworks Association. And it's good to have you three here in our studio. And Keely, thanks for joining us from Brampton today in the Region of Peel. Can I just do a fact check with you off the top? Yes. Are you the sewer lady or the sewer goddess? Which is it?
You check. You choose.
I decide? Okay. We'll see how well you do on the show, and then we'll make a decision on that. This is, without question, the sexiest topic we have ever done on this program, eh? Water infrastructure. Here we go. We're going to make it sizzle. Michelle, start us off here. What are the chances that a community in Ontario could experience the same kind of large water main failures that were all over the news in places like Calgary and Montreal earlier this year?
Certainly the possibility exists. We have lots of aging infrastructure in the province. The one advantage we do have here in Ontario is the drinking water quality management system, which involves a very comprehensive risk assessment process that each municipality has to undertake on a routine basis. And as a result of those risk assessments, they do have to develop emergency plans and emergency response strategies to ensure that the catastrophic failures that we see can be mitigated or prevented.
Keely, let's do some real, water management 101 here. How does a water main fail?
How does a water main fail? Typically, it's a break in a water main where you have our water mains are encased in fill to protect them. They can be either plastic or they can be concrete. And when that fails, you get a break. And when that break happens, our water mains are under pressure because you're pushing a lot of water through them at obviously a high pressure. And when that break happens, it can be catastrophic.
Nick, is it simply a case of old age most of the time?
It can be, but not always. Corrosion plays a factor. Underground metallic pipes, certainly there's pressure spikes less frequently that can cause damage to water infrastructure. And in some cases, it is absolutely old age.
And Barbara, how big a deal is leakage in water mains across our province?
Yeah, so whenever we have leakage in our engineering systems, whether sewer or water main, residents are paying for that, are paying to treat that water and try to convey it. And so it's very, very costly to have water main breaks. And also, I estimate about 60% of the water, when a water main fails, 60% of the water is getting down into the sanitary sewer and showing up as leakage into the sewer. And if the water doesn't go up, it goes down. And the right-of-way is all built at the same time, so there are favorable flow paths. So it costs us double.
Now, we're doing a program on this, so obviously we think this is a bit of a big deal. Is this a bit of a big deal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because?
Certainly. Well, because I guess I would say Canadians, we've come to expect that we're going to have 100% water at our house 100% of the time, the morning, noon, night, no matter the temperature, the weather.
We take it for granted, don't we?
It's called level of service. Yeah. I think it's reasonable. I think we need to start thinking about perhaps the level of service we come to expect from our infrastructure cannot meet these beautiful ideals or whatever. Maybe the odd break where you have to use bottled water for a few days. Maybe we need to learn to tolerate that because we certainly are way behind on funding our infrastructure. Way, way behind.
Okay, let me go to Keely on that. You are in a part of the province that has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last well, let's say 10, 25 years or so. What's a bigger priority for you in Peel? Is it fixing what you've got right now or building new stuff to accommodate all the new development that's happening?
Wow, that's a good question. I would say historically, the focus has been on maintaining our existing infrastructure system. We've got over $28 billion in assets in just the water and wastewater infrastructure. So that's a massive program just to maintain it. But more recently, it's the growth infrastructure that's really become priority for us. In our upcoming budget for 2025, we're looking at 80% of our capital budget is going to be for growth infrastructure. That new infrastructure.
If you don't mind, Steve,
please.
You have to do both. And this is the really difficult balancing act for municipalities is given our limited resources, financial resources, and people too. I mean, there's only so many people in the industry. How do you do both? How do you deal with your areas of largest risk while you're making sure that you're still providing the ability for the community to grow as well, because both are important?
Well, you've got an even bigger problem, I would suspect, in Hamilton than Brampton, in as much as Hamilton's a city that's more than 200 years old. You've got some real old stuff there, presumably.
We absolutely do. And I would say it's a different challenge. I mean, we have in Hamilton the second oldest water system in Canada, the third oldest wastewater system. And when you think of relying in some cases on infrastructure that is as much as 120 years old, ironically, sometimes that's your most robust infrastructure because there were different manufacturing practices and things historically. But it does carry an element of risk. And, you know, as I said to our own city council just this past Monday, when you're in the water business running a utility, it is very much about risk management and where can you tolerate risk? Where do you have operational programs in place that allow you to mitigate things? And where do you absolutely have to move forward with a fast-tracked or preferably a planned capital intervention?
Michelle, we have, or I shouldn't say we, the province of Ontario has set a very ambitious goal to build 1.5 million homes by the year 2031. And that means all of you are sort of on the hook to make sure that we've got water systems that can accommodate that kind of growth. Talk to us about the biggest challenges that people who do for a living what you folks do for a living have in order to accommodate that future growth.
It's multifaceted in terms of how the municipalities are being tasked to approach this. We tend to forecast out 20 to 30 years with the master plans and the capital plans. And when those targets are moving very quickly, there's not always enough money in the bank to do it. And so we need to look at other funding tools or financing tools to allow municipalities to quickly deliver the infrastructure that's needed to support that growth. I think there's an opportunity for better alignment with developers and timing of when those expansions are actually needed and when the municipality is able to start collecting on those rates, water user rates and property taxes, and also better alignment with some of the other water users, big business, the province itself in terms of education and healthcare, because those can all pose significant demands on a water and wastewater system in terms of supporting that growth.
Keely, what would you add to that in terms of what you've got to do to be ready for the kind of growth anticipated?
Yeah, I would agree with all of what Michelle has just said. One of the big challenges with growth infrastructure is finding that delicate balance between having the infrastructure ready in advance of the growth coming on, because when we're talking about water and wastewater, those take years, can take a decade to construct, and it needs to be in the ground and ready before the development happens, before the homes are built. So you need to anticipate and work with the industry to understand when it's coming forward, because it's debt financed as well. Municipalities issue debt, and in our case, this is significant debt that we're looking at over the next 20 years to accommodate the massive growth that's coming. And there's a risk to municipalities that if we build that infrastructure and they don't come, then we're carrying those costs until it's eventually paid back through the development charges.
Let me do a quick follow-up. You got any idea how much money you're spending over the next 20 years on all this?
We are estimating at this point about $17 billion in water and wastewater infrastructure over the next 20 years to accommodate the new housing pledges.
That's real money.
That's big money.
That is big money. Barbara, what would you add?
Yeah, I would add that so another way to find this capacity in our infrastructure, sewers and water, it would be to use the infrastructure we have better. So to reduce leakages in water systems, average water leakage across Ontario is 13%, 14%. That means 14% of the water that we treat and pump from the water treatment station doesn't arrive at people's homes. It gets lost in the ground. So if we could reduce that water loss, we have ways of reducing water loss. It's not easy, but I mean, there are municipalities sitting at 40, 50% water loss. I mean, it could be very high. And equally in sewers, as you know, our sewers are practically full of clean water that should not be there. That's rainwater and groundwater getting into sewers. Well, getting that water out of sewers would free up the capacity, some of the capacity. It's not going to cover all our development, but it's a much more inexpensive way. And I would encourage municipalities to get back to basics and maintaining our infrastructure and freeing up this capacity that's being used for inappropriate uses.
Can I do a follow-up with you on this? The 13% leakage you said, on average. Do municipalities know that that's happening?
Oh, yes.
They all know they're leaking water.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Are they doing anything about it?
Yes. Oh, yes, I would say, but most places have a leak detection program and fixing and all that. But another issue that I'm seeing is that municipalities are very risk averse, of course. So they're not always forthcoming about how their systems are performing. It used to be that municipalities would report water loss every year at budget time and sewer leakage every year at budget time, but I'm not seeing that being reported anymore because it makes the municipality look bad if the leakages are high. But I would just mention, to Nick's point, when our infrastructure was built, the materials, the ground, proximity to water, all of these things affect leakage in our infrastructure. So if a leakage is high somewhere, it doesn't mean the municipality hasn't done its due diligence. I would just like to see municipalities know what their leakage is this year and say, look, we're going to reduce it by 1% till next year, and then next year at budget time, we're going to report again how much we spent and how much we reduced the leakage by. I'd like to actually share with the public some of this information so the public understand what they're doing.
Do you have any idea what the leakage is in Hamilton right now?
We're sitting at 24%. So
Yikes,
we know
that
very
seems high.
well. And just speaking to Barbara's point about being open to share that, I think it's flawed thinking if you're not willing to share that information. We're talking about the fact that water and wastewater infrastructure is out of sight and out of mind. So how do our community members, how do our customers, how do our municipal councils know what's going on with this infrastructure if we're not the ones to tell the story? And just speaking to the Hamilton experience, we have a very aggressive leak detection and repair program in place. We brought that number down by almost 5% over the past few years.
Awesome.
But it does take focused inspection, and it does take focused resources in order to do the work. But you can also tell the benefit from a expense perspective on what you are saving by making those investments, and that's an important part of the picture too.
I recognize the city pin on your left lapel. What does the other pin say?
This is me being on brand. This says, I love Hamilton tap water. And I absolutely do. Toronto is nice as well, but I selfishly think we have the best water in Ontario and Hamilton.
But do you really?
I absolutely do, yes.
Okay, very good. What can you do about, if you've got almost a quarter of all the water going through the pipes in Hamilton leaking somewhere, which is obviously a complete waste, when do you think you can get that number down to zero?
It's unrealistic for it ever to be zero. So industry standard is generally 13 to 15%. And when you're thinking of that leaking water, it's not all just water coming out of pipes. That's water that's being used to fight fires. That's water that's being used operationally in the system to make sure that water quality is maintained. So there's a lot of areas where we call it non-revenue water. Where you have water that is not being delivered to a customer and billed at a meter for revenue back to the utility. But getting from 24% down to 15% in a system as old as Hamilton, that is going to be a challenge. We haven't set a target to it, but if we can do 5% in just a few years, it's not unrealistic to think that we could be lower than 20%, before 2030.
Let's follow the money here, shall we? Keely, I'll come to you first on this one, because you mentioned $17 billion that's the cost over the next 20 years that you're looking at to pay for all this stuff. Who pays and how?
Again, because the infrastructure goes in advance of the development coming online, it is debt financed by the municipality. So the Region of Peel in this case would go out to capital markets to issue debt for us to proceed with the work. And then we carry that debt, which is eventually paid back through development charges. When you hear about development charges in the news, that's the fees that are paid back by the developers that are bringing that online, and it's to pay for those hard services like the pipes and the treatment facilities as well. We always think just of the pipes, but the treatment facilities for our water and wastewater require enormous expansion in order to accommodate the growth as well.
But some of that ends up on the property tax bill too, does it not?
It does not. We separate out the water wastewater rates from the tax bill. So if there is any outstanding amounts that are not collected through development charges, that would actually land on the rates. So the amount that you're paying, the fees that you're paying for your water on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, depending on where you are.
Barbara, what's your view on who should pay?
Yeah, so it's clear by now that municipalities do not have sufficient funds to fund our infrastructure. We already know our infrastructure is aging. We're way behind. Like we're in a tough spot here. And by the way, the first thing I thought when I saw that Calgary water main break, I thought, man, sewers are going to get it in the shorts again because we.
Is that a technical term?
Very much so. Yes, yes. Because we after Walkerton, regulations in Ontario became much more stringent with respect to water, and many municipalities really focus on their water systems and don't pay enough attention to their sewer systems. And with this new, I can see municipalities running out there, oh my gosh, we need money for water, and the government's talking about, but municipalities do not have enough money through user fees and the tax base to fund this infrastructure. Is not there. We need stable sources of funding from the provincial and the federal governments. Not one-off announcements with criteria, because in my experience, and you guys probably have the same experience, when there's criteria around a funding program, the municipality looks at the criteria and they pick a project that best meets those criteria because they want to get the funding, they want to achieve the funding, but it's frequently not the highest and best use of those dollars. It's the project that is most likely to get the funding. And if there were stable funding available to municipalities from, and I don't know which federal or provincial, like I don't know enough about which government, maybe both, politicians wouldn't be able to make those fancy announcements they make all the time during election season, which we're seeing right now. There's all these funding announcements going on. If instead of doing that, we had stable funding, municipalities could plan ahead and plan their infrastructure replacement programs much more readily.
Michelle, who should pay for all this?
So, well, Steve, I agree to some extent with Barbara, but the bottom line is there is only one taxpayer. And at the end of the day, people don't understand what it actually costs them for those services. As we mentioned, we've got development charges are part of it. We've got provincial and federal infrastructure funding are part of it. We've got property taxes. We've got rates. If it was clear in the rate structure and people understood the value of water, it would be an easier business case to say we need to maintain, operate, improve, and expand the system. But outside of the City of Toronto, most residents or most customers don't get a water bill. They get a hydro bill that has a water component on it. And so it can easily get buried and it can easily get dwarfed by the cost of electricity. And so it becomes much more challenging for the municipality to really explain what the cost of providing that service is.
In which case, if we don't see how much it actually costs, we probably waste a lot more than we need to.
Absolutely. It's hard to drive conservation when you're either sitting on the shores of Lake Ontario and thinking that the supply is infinite, or when you really don't see that changing your behavior is going to have an impact on your wallet. So at the end of the day, I do agree that particularly for rural and remote systems, there is a need for predictable funding outside of the tax base, particularly where the user base could be shrinking, but the value of the assets isn't decreasing.
What's Hamilton's view on how that should be achieved?
It's a really interesting time in the water wastewater infrastructure, and I mean, I'll say I think the province did a really good thing when they introduced Ontario Regulation 588 several years ago. This is asset management.
Regulation 588. I read about it every night. Just before going to bed, I always read about it. Well,
it'll definitely help you go to sleep.
I'm a big fan of 589 too, just so you know.
So Regulation 588, it requires municipalities to complete and report on the states of their assets. And there's a reason why we're having these types of conversations more frequently here in 2024. These conversations weren't necessarily happening 10 years ago. And it's because a report to City Council, but also a report to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And everyone's reporting using similar language, similar methodology, and everyone's done the work now to say, here is what our infrastructure deficits are. And I know very clearly in Hamilton now that we were underinvesting by more than $100 million every single year across our water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure portfolio. 5 years ago, I couldn't have given that number out, right? But where it's gotten interesting is now that all the utilities and all the municipalities are able to report the same numbers, and there's a reason why you're seeing a reaction from the provincial and federal governments on this. It speaks to the fact that they are listening. But that regulation and requirements for municipalities has really been a game changer in how we tell our stories.
The 100 billion figure refers to what?
Sorry, the 100 million.
100 million, excuse
me. In Hamilton.
That's your city alone.
That's what we should have been spending every single year into our water, wastewater, stormwater infrastructure prior to 2022 that we weren't. So $100 million a year we should have been spending, and we were not doing so.
And the result and consequences are what?
The result is aging and failing infrastructure. I talked earlier about managing risk, and if you're not investing at the right time with the right intervention, then you're increasing that risk. It's way more expensive to deal with an emergency than it is to take a planned, proactive approach to repair something the right way in advance.
Keely, you don't have to name names here if you don't want to, but I presume in the course of your job, you are having conversations with politicians that go something like this. Hey, you know, Councillor fill in the blank, we sure need to spend X number of dollars doing X, Y, and Z, or else your constituents are going to be coming to you screaming bloody murder because they turn the tap on and nothing comes out. And I presume Councillor X comes back to you and says, yeah, but I got 50 other priorities that they're also yelling at me about, so I don't know if I can give you the money you need. A, does that conversation happen? And B, if it does, how do you handle it?
Steve, I'm happy to say that conversation doesn't happen in Peel. Similar to what Nick was referring to, we have a really strong asset management program that's been developed over a number of years. It certainly was a challenge, I think, at one point in time prior to the words asset management evolving when it comes to infrastructure. And we're able to present on what our levels of service are. Council endorses what the level of service is going to be, and where is it fair, is it good, is it excellent? We aim for good as our overall level of service that we're going to provide. And if we're going to maintain that levels of service, then there's a corresponding amount that we need to invest to achieve that. And council knows the importance, our council knows the importance of maintaining that infrastructure, of not having breaks that interrupt businesses or homes. And as a result of that, we've had, similar to a lot of other municipalities as well, we've had a number of years of an infrastructure levy that's been on top of our base rate, what we would be charging if we just wanted to maintain service, but we've got an infrastructure levy on top of that, and that's to make up the backlog of all of the work that wasn't done for many years. And Nick mentioned it's common across Canada. It just has to do with the timing for when much of our infrastructure in Canada was built, and it's all coming of age at the same point. And perhaps some of the people in the past didn't have the foresight to start putting the money aside for replacement or rehabilitation of some of that infrastructure.
And a quick follow-up. Your ratepayers in Peel don't squawk when you've got to put those costs higher?
We've had we recently changed, it's interesting, the conversation around the use and trying to reduce use to reduce your costs. We do have a separate bill that goes out to our ratepayers. It's not done through hydro, so they do see those numbers. And we changed our rate structure recently because it used to just be based on the amount that you used. But there's a whole infrastructure system out there that we're still paying for regardless of how much is being used. So we shifted to a different rate structure, and some of those lower users are now paying a little bit more. And we've heard from them, and I think that we'll be reviewing that through our next budget cycle as a result.
Okay. Michelle, I remember, now we're going back maybe 40 years here, when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, she privatized water delivery in the United Kingdom. And, you know, the jury was out on whether or not that was a good idea to do. What would you think about privatizing some of these water systems here in the province of Ontario?
Well, with the recent experience in the UK on the privatized water systems, I'd say a lot of people are reluctant to go down that road. There are a number of organizations exploring the Municipal Services Corporation model or the public utility model, because we do have several of them in existence in the province. And the main advantages to going down that road, and that's not privatization, but it's more of a corporate structure, is the access to debt financing that municipalities don't have. So they can raise capital in different ways, and they can also have different governance structures that allow for unelected officials to be making decisions about the utility.
Is that a good idea?
I think there's an opportunity there to make decisions on what's in the best interest of the infrastructure, as opposed to being worried about getting reelected.
Right. In which case, Nick, has the City of Hamilton ever considered privatizing out the water services?
There's conversations that are ongoing in the industry now. You know, I can tell you we had an experience prior to me joining the city where we contracted out the operation of our water and wastewater treatment facilities, as well as all of the outstations, pumping stations, reservoirs, and we learned a very hard lesson in Hamilton about there not necessarily being value in that model. The challenge with private operations, and it's not exclusive, but it is very common, is that when you've got a private entity who's looking to derive a profit from the contract that they're in, they may not look at the system, the infrastructure, with the same scrutiny that municipal operations would. So I would say it's critically important that municipal water utilities remain owned, operated by public entities in a not-for-profit manner.
Got a view on that?
Yeah, I agree strongly with that. Because when you have a third party operating your treatment systems, so for example, where I live in Region Waterloo, a third party is operating the sewage treatment plants, excuse me, which means the regions become very hands-off about their sewage. They don't really pay attention to sewers and all, because I think they're just thinking, oh, somebody else is operating it. We're not going to worry about leakage and all that, and they certainly don't put any investment in improving the sewers. And I think that's simply because somebody else is operating the system, so it's just not on their radar screen, and that's dangerous because sewers leak.
Keely, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to the conversation about the different structures, potential structures for water, not private, but the current structure, talking about Municipal Services Corporation, having non-elected officials on. One of the benefits of having council as the owner and operator of the system is the transparency that comes through that process, because all of the decisions are brought to open council. The rates are provided, full breakdown of all of that. And so there's certainly some benefits on that end to having it under municipal ownership. Not to mention the high value of the assets allows us to borrow at a very competitive rate through the private markets.
And I guess the fact is, at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, people don't approach the private company. They approach their politicians, their elected people, to resolve it. So they're accountable at the end of the day anyway. Fair to say?
I would agree.
You would agree. Okay. Can we just, in our remaining few moments here, Barbara, I'll go to you first on this. People watching this or people listening to this obviously have a role. They can do things to either make things better or worse.
Right.
What can they do to make things better?
Yeah, a couple of things residents can do. We've been telling people for years to have an emergency water supply at home. We really need to have that emergency water supply. So if what happens in Calgary happens here, in my house, I just have a couple of those big jugs from the water store or whatever. I never buy bottled water, but you need a couple of those in your basement, and, depending on the size of your family, whatever. So if the water system goes down for 3 or 4 days, you're covered. You've got access to clean water. Something else residents, we're not telling residents, but these are very important things. In a water system, cities operate the valves every year. They operate the valves, exercise the valves to make sure that they're operational, because when you need a valve shut off, you need to be able to shut it off. However, everyone has a valve in their basement. It's right beside your sewer cleanout. It's your water shutoff valve, your main water shutoff valve. No one ever touches it for years. And if you get a leak in your house and you can't get the fixture turned off, you could have a big flood. So we want to make sure that water valve is operating. So spring and fall, we check your smoke and CO detectors, and you'll be down there looking at your sump pump anyway, Steve. Just exercise that valve and make sure that this is an emergency valve. If you need it, you want to be able to turn it off. If it doesn't work, hire a plumber.
You don't want that thing snapping off, right? When you
no, well, mostly you won't be able to turn it. Yeah, and then then if something's leaking in your house, you're going to have a major leak.
See, that's why we have you on this program, because you are always filled with great advice on these matters.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, so in which case, remember we went full circle to the beginning? Sewer lady, sewer goddess? Sewer goddess. I think we can say that. Okay, I think that's our time, everybody, and I'm really grateful to all of you for coming onto our program today. Keely Dedman from the Region Appeal, Michelle Grenier, Ontario Waterworks Association, Nick Winters from Hamilton Water in the Steel City, Barbara Robinson, Norton Engineering. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us here on TVO tonight, and may all of your water remain clean. Half of all water tests in at least 44 Ottawa area high schools over 5 years showed traces of lead that exceeded federal standards, according to an examination by the Investigative Journalism Bureau. Concerned parents say they are not notified when tests exceed guidelines. Robert Cribb is founder of the Investigative Journalism Bureau, and he joins us now to discuss his reporting on this issue. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. What was the inspiration for deciding to investigate this story?
I've honestly been on this for about 10 years, and it started with, I was a dad, I had a young daughter, I read a short little blurb in a parenting magazine about lead and the impact of lead on kids. And it's terrifying, you know, a neurotoxin, reduces IQ, cognitive development issues. And I lived in an old house in Toronto, and old houses are where this tends to show up, so I had my pipes tested. I had my water tested.
What'd you find?
It was elevated. Not dramatically, but significantly above what it should be. So I paid, you know, about $5,000. I had my front lawn dug up, and I had these pipes removed, and I just thought, man, I had no idea about this. I don't think most people do. So I started digging in. It was journalism that flowed from life, effectively, and the more I read and learned about it, the more concerning it was. And the fact that it's not on the public radar at all, nobody talks about it, I thought was interesting. And so I started doing stories about it, and here we are 10 years later. I'm still sort of beating this drum.
And would it be the case that in most of the older schools in this province, the pipes are still full of lead?
Well, I mean, this is what we've been digging at, and there is data, and we've slowly gathered it all and analyzed it, and in a striking number of cases, particularly in old schools, yeah, I mean, there's very high levels of lead.
Going to give you a couple of names here. Christopher and Nicole Shadbolt, whom you met during your investigation.
Yeah.
Why were they significant?
Well, one of the things that popped out for me in the last round of reviewing this data is Ottawa. There was something strange about Ottawa. There was just so many conspicuous high levels of lead. So we started digging in on that, and we eventually met Nicole Shadbolt. She's a family physician in Ottawa. She'd read one of our previous stories. She looked into her school, so we published this database, which is on our website. You can type in your kid's school or daycare, and it will provide all of the test results.
Give the website URL. What's the website?
ijb.utoronto.ca.
There we go. Okay.
And so she did this after reading one of our stories, and she found that her kid's school, Maryvale High School in Ottawa, had exceeded, almost 60% of the tests had exceeded. And she's a doctor. She had concerns about it. She called pediatrician, had her son, Christopher, 13-year-old son, tested, and in fact is at very high levels of lead. He drinks a lot of water, apparently 4 liters a day. And so she had her pipes tested at home, nothing. No other explanation for this level of lead in his body. And so it was in fact, the pediatrician said he'd never seen levels this high ever.
So you were able to conclusively determine that it probably came from the school?
That's certainly her feeling, yeah. There's no other explanation.
What other sources did you use in your investigation?
Well, the main source is provincial data. So luckily in Ontario, there is mandatory testing, and that testing is available. It's not particularly intuitive. The average person is not going to be able to understand it. So we've created this database that makes it utterly simple and intuitive. You just type in, and there's a chart. It'll tell you what percentage failed. And then we went to every expert that we can find on the planet who is specifically devoted to this area of study. And what we've learned from that is essentially that there is no safe level of lead. So the safe level is 0. And in many cases, and the vast majority of these cases, the level is not 0. And the impacts on kids, I mean, it's kind of terrifying, actually, when you really dig into it. We're talking about, young developing brains. It's a neurotoxin. The loss of IQ is sort of the number one thing that scientists have determined. And the only real solution, according to the ones that we've talked to, is removing the lead. So there's Band-Aids that are typically done, flushing the pipes. If you have kids and you've taken them to
remember,
daycare,
they turn the water on for half an hour before
I remember
they get to
this,
school.
right? So I'd walk in and all the taps are running, and I would ask, sort of, what's that about? And said, well, we have a lead problem, so we flush the taps. Great, that's great for like an hour or two. By lunch, the science shows it's often back, depending on the fixtures and the specifics of that location. So it's not a solution. That's not a solution. The solution is you got to remove the lead. The problem with that is it's expensive. This is a big job. These are pipes.
So tell me what happened when you go to the school, the Shadbolt's kid goes to, and you say, here's what we found. You've got a problem. What do you get back to you?
So Steve, this is one of those issues. It is such an intractable problem that public officials tend not to be very willing to open up on it because it's not an easy fix. So we've asked again and again, what about this? What are you doing? How do you fix it? And the responses are boilerplate and effectively, well, we mitigate, and where we find it, we fix the tap. But there's no clear, decisive response to that. And one of the complaints that Nicole Shadbolt has, and many parents have when they learn about this, is why wouldn't we be sent a memo? We get memos home from the kids every day about everything. But when there's excessive lead in the water, we don't get a proactive message. Like we have to go digging for it. And it's often not easy to find. And so at the very least, there should be, many parents argue, a mandatory kind of proactive informing of high lead levels to parents.
Who's responsible for testing the water to see what the lead levels are?
The school boards, under mandate, under legislation from the province. So there's mandatory testing. They have to do it with a certain frequency depending on where they are and who they are, et cetera, and all of which is great, and the fact that it's accessible is great. In many provinces, you can't know at all as a parent. There's no way to get access to that.
And they do it. They actually do the testing.
Yeah, they do the testing.
And they make the results public?
Well, they make it public in a way, not in a way that you're going to understand necessarily. It's a big database that you'd have to decipher, but yeah, it's accessible.
What levels are, and I know you said 0 before is what obviously is the ideal, but that's not what the federal or provincial guidelines are, for that matter, right?
No. 0 is of course, the goal long term. But the very interesting thing in Ontario is we have a standard, a safety guideline. It's 10 parts per billion, okay? 5 years ago, Health Canada, the federal government, that was the level. They cut it in half. It's 5 parts per billion now. The reason they did that is to reflect the very serious health issues. As science evolves, it's become very clear that 10 parts per billion does not provide the level of safety that is required. So the federal government drops it, cuts it in half. That's the standard nationally. Still today, in Ontario, 5 years after that, we still continue to use this outdated safety guideline, which provides a false sense of security. That means half of these tests are passing at the provincial level, but failing at the federal level.
Well, who's in charge?
The province.
So the province's number is the one that's operative here.
Yeah.
So if we only get to 10 parts per billion of lead in the water, they think they're doing their job.
It's a pass. Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about. Except that that's not true.
Can you just go into a little more detail of what happens to a child's health, particularly during the formative years, where, as you point out, the brain is still growing, if there is excess exposure to lead in that child's drinking water?
Yeah, so the data that we have on that is it's population level data, right? So it's very difficult to determine this on an individual basis. You'd have to be testing constantly. So the biggest concern, and the one that comes up again and again when you talk to experts about this, is cognitive development. So it's the brain for children, and there's been very clear science showing impact on IQ levels, right? This is terrifying for parents to think that the consumption of water at school, where they spend most of their day learning, literally learning, the very place that they go to be enriched and nourished intellectually, is a place where they're consuming water that can actually undermine that. So that's the number one thing. But it's an issue for adults as well: cardiovascular issues, kidney issues, hypertension. It's ugly, right? This is the reason we banned lead. There's no lead paint anymore. We went through this process and tried to remove lead as much as we can. And we've done so effectively through public policy and legislation. And yet, here we are, it's in drinking water in schools, and yet what percentage of Ontarians are aware of that? I would argue it's tiny, it's minuscule.
How does the lead get into the water in the first place?
So, great question. There's a couple of answers to that. If it's old lead pipes, so literally pipes buried in the ground or inside the walls or floors of buildings, that's obviously the source. But it's also the fixtures themselves. So it could be the water tap, the faucet, etc. They can also have lead.
Got it. Now, you told us earlier it is the school board's responsibility to test the lead levels in the water. Whose responsibility is it if they discover that the levels are too high? Whose responsibility is it to fix this problem?
The school boards themselves, under advisement and monitoring from the province. Public health, municipal public health agencies are also become aware of this and have oversight over it. So there is a mechanism in place. There is regulation and there is oversight of it. The questions emerge is what's the right number that they're testing for, where there's a clear consensus among experts that it's just too high. We're being far too permissive in this province with the numbers that we're agreeing are fine. And then, what happens with oversight? So you can test today a tap in your kid's school. It can exceed, you can fix it. There's no guarantee that there isn't other problems in that school. There's no guarantee that the problem's been fixed because the lead has not been fully removed.
Now, we gave stats off the top that we're all based in the city of Ottawa and the schools there. Do you have any reason to believe that schools in the rest of the province are any different?
No. We've dug deep into the whole province. The Ottawa story is obviously unique and it's conspicuous, but these issues are across the province. So 2,300 schools we identified as having exceedances over the last 4 years. We looked at schools across the province. Toronto, I was, of course, fascinated to figure out what's happening in the school where my kid went, and there were some problems there that have since been addressed. But yeah, no, there's nothing unique in terms of the findings that we found in Ottawa. It's just that there was such a cluster, a concerted number of them there.
Are school board officials seized of the significance of this story?
Well, let me give you my opinion on that. Officially, on the record, no. Flat out.
Officially on the record?
No.
They're not interested?
Well, because they're not answering the questions. I mean, one would think if they were seized of this issue and concerned about it, there would be a vigorous exchange of information and ideas about it. The responses we get are tepid and boilerplate and tend to be very defensive. And I would say that for the province too. So we've gone to them a number of times and said, why do you maintain a safety guideline twice the level of the federal government? What is the justification for that? And the response to that question repeatedly is silence. Not a single justification, rationalization, scientific study, not a single shred of evidence to suggest that this is a responsible piece of public policy.
Now, you do this work, obviously, in hopes of presenting information to decision makers who can then take it and fix it.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that that's happening or could happen?
No.
None.
It has been a total failure. This journalism has been a total failure. If your measurement of success is affecting change, it has totally failed.
So how do we get success out of failure?
You come on the agenda and you try and raise it.
You try to embarrass them out of it?
Yeah. You try and amplify it. You try and ultimately, listen, no politician is going to change public policy because a reporter is doing stories about it. Ultimately, the only thing that causes that kind of change is the public, its parents, its voters. And there has been no real mobilization of concern that is sufficient to bubble up to Queen's Park.
Can you tell me about, we got 20 seconds here. You would think parents would be outraged by this. Why are they not making a stink?
It's interesting. When they become aware of it, they do. Nicole Shadbolt, there you go, raising this issue. There's parents groups that are chatting online about it. So there is mobilization, but it's an interesting problem. Like, I don't know why. I don't know why there isn't more vigorous, vociferous protest about it. It's a very Canadian reaction.
Well, maybe you've made a bit of a stink here tonight on TVO, and that'll lead to something, God willing.
I hope so.
Robert Cribb, Investigative Journalism Bureau, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight.
Thanks for doing it.
What if heat from this, and this could be used somewhere else in your community rather than flushing it away? If we could capture that neglected heat in our wastewater, passing it on like an efficient heat-sharing program, well, if you live in Markham, Ontario, you might soon be participating in such a thing. Our TVO crew and the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, traveled to Markham District Energy, or MDE for short, for the breaking ground ceremony of their latest green technology asset, the world's largest wastewater energy transfer project. The first of its kind was in False Creek, Vancouver for the Olympic Games back in 2010, serving the 2,800 athletes and officials housed in the Olympic Village.
So here we are today to celebrate the beginning of our 25th anniversary year as a company and as a district energy system. There's another piece of infrastructure that was here 25 years ago, the York Region Wastewater Main. It's been here the entire time. Energy has always been flowing in that wastewater main.
And now the heat energy from this wastewater will be used again.
York Region's really excited to be partnering with Markham District Energy on this innovative project. The basics of it is that we're going to be using sewage, which is flowing by the property here already on its way for treatment at Duffin Creek, and they'll be using heat pump technology to be able to heat their district heating system, and that provides heating for numerous buildings that are connected to their system.
York Region is a signatory to an agreement with MDE that allows us to connect to York Region's main sewer line that carries 2,500 liters per second.
In the summer, when it's really hot out like it is today, they'll actually be able to use the same technology to inject heat into the sewage to create cooling.
You really see here a community of people who have been working really creatively to support this exciting, growing Canadian municipality, and to be sure that this municipality has the energy it needs, the heating it needs, the cooling it needs as it grows and as we have to hit net zero together.
Not a lot of people know what district energy is. They know the electricity grid, they know the natural gas grid coming to their homes and so on. District energy is maybe considered by some the missing grid. It's a thermal energy grid. It's an underground system. So from a central plant, that's one of our plants that we're standing here at, we produce hot water, we produce chill water at these plants, and that gets fed in this underground system to buildings that are connected to the grid.
We are looking at plant operations for Markham Centre. From this location, Taylor, our operator on site today, can control 3 facilities. Manages the heating and cooling load for all the condos and a couple of townhomes in the area, and a few data centers.
District energy is sometimes referred to as community energy or a thermal energy grid. There's different terminologies in different parts of the world, but it's a very old way of heating and cooling cities and urban centers. So every single building here in Markham Centre, as far as you can see, is connected to our systems. There's thousands of district energy systems in cities and campuses around the world. In Canada, there's hundreds of systems. One here in Markham. The oldest system is in London, Ontario, which is about 150 years old. The University of Toronto has a community energy or a thermal district energy system that was, I think, built in 1912, so it's over 100 years there. Enwave is the largest district energy system in Canada, in downtown Toronto. They have a heating system that dates back 50 or 60 years, and more recently they built this deep lake water cooling system, taking energy from the lake, which is high efficiency environmentally, to use that energy in the lake to cool the buildings in the downtown core. So they're the largest system in Canada. We're probably the fastest growing system in Canada, and then there's lots of other examples across the country.
According to the International Energy Agency, IEA, 90% of district heating networks around the world burn fossil fuels, including MDE, which relies mainly on natural gas-fired combined heat and power plants. This project is helping to offset that reliance on fossil fuels.
Energy has always been very, very inexpensive in North America, in Canada, in Ontario. When we are doing this project, which is very capital intensive, what we are really doing is avoiding the purchase of natural gas, which is what we normally use to produce the heating energy at all of our plants. We're avoiding using natural gas and using electricity to power the low carbon center heat pumps.
District energy is an important solution to decarbonize energy systems for cities, communities, and campuses around the world. Investments in district energy infrastructure are accelerating the shift to lower carbon solutions. One of the first environmental strategies deployed by cities' district energy displaced hundreds of individual coal boilers, making air cleaner, buildings safer, and easier to operate and manage. When constructed, this wastewater transfer center is expected to reduce MDE's carbon emissions for the production of thermal energy by over 30,000 tons per year, significantly advancing MDE's goal of becoming net zero by 2050 and contributing to the overall emissions reductions. Over time, district energy systems have evolved to leverage new technologies like industrial heat pumps, geothermal energy sharing, and a wide range of renewable resources.
Back in 1998, when the ice storm ripped through the eastern part of Ontario and Quebec, it was an eye-opener for a lot of communities to realize how vulnerable we could be.
That's one of the early reasons and rationale for what we did here. Unlike hydro systems that have poles above ground and you know they do get hit by impact, you don't know a lot about district energy because it's an underground system. Nobody knows it's there. After 24 years, we're at 99.999% uptime reliability. It's hard to put our system out of commission when we're underground.
Again, with the help of these the green municipal funds, is a thermal storage tank, hot water thermal storage tank. So we're producing power and we're recovering heat off the power plants. It's a simple generation cycle. Sometimes you can't use all the heat in that moment.
Yep.
And if we couldn't use it at the moment, we'd have to wait.
You have to just put it
So this is your largest hot water storage tank in Markham, right here.
Wow.
So we store the energy here and use it then when we can use it. So long showers are okay. Long showers are okay. So I mean that's
a very.
You know what? And we are 30 years behind Europeans in about district energy.
Yes.
And when we have our friends from Scandinavia come over, some of Rob's members from Europe, and before we had this, they say, "Where's your thermal storage?" Like you don't waste anything. What they're doing, you know, it's such an easy asset to build, so we build it.
I'd also like to highlight the additional partnerships that have made today possible, in particular the Government of Canada. Honestly, you've put in place programs that enable green innovation, and this project is the recipient of funding from the Low Carbon Energy Fund, and MDE has signed the first contract for differences in all of Canada. Another great achievement, and thank you, Minister.
Carbon needs to be priced at something in the neighborhood of $300 or $400 a ton. That's the sort of value you have to put on the climate damage due to the use of fossil fuels. I know the Canadian government, when they're making decisions internally, they're doing a shadow pricing of around $300 a ton. It's not $300 a ton, but they're saying, let's assume it is, and we'll make our decision on making investments in that way.
Most importantly, those investments by the Canada Growth Fund are helping to create great jobs for Canadians today while keeping Canada, and when we think Markham, we think green, so Markham, on track to net zero.
Our current carbon price is around $80. It's going to $170 in Canada if it's not interrupted. And eventually in Canada, it'll have to go beyond that. So the contract for differences that we've signed protects us in the first 10 years of any carbon policy change.
Carbon contracts for difference reduce risk for companies investing in clean technologies by guaranteeing the price of carbon or carbon credits for a fixed period of time, regardless of the market price.
Yeah, so we recover all the waste heat from the chill water system. Okay. Through these heat pump technology, which is powered by electricity, and elevates it, and we feed it back into the heating system. Sorry, where's my Enbridge friend? Sorry, I'm just telling all the things we're replacing natural gas, but... This asset, when fully operational, reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 4,600 tons a year. So we had 1,000 over there. Yeah. Our combined heat and power plant is reduced by about 7,500 tons a year. This is 4,600. And then we're going to talk about the wastewater energy transfer project as the big one.
Other places in the world are decades ahead of us in terms of value in carbon and pricing carbon. And that's supported investments in clean energy, low carbon technology. This project is our first big move, this wastewater project, but there's other technologies hitting our sector big time, which is the other one is deep geothermal. There's a project that's just been launched in Germany. They're not just drilling a few hundred yards into a ground source, they're drilling 3 or 4 kilometers to get to the temperature deep underground, pulling that temperature up and heating an entire community. So deep geothermal is where we will be eventually. That's the next big move. And interestingly, I wouldn't have thought I'd be talking about this 5 years ago in our business, but there's lots of talk about small modular reactors, like small, not 500 megawatt or 600 megawatt nuclear plants, but a 15 megawatt small modular reactor that could fit in this building. That is clean energy. So these are technologies that will feed a district system like this and truly be zero carbon emitting in the years to come. And we're just along that path.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, October 2nd, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, we look at one of our capital city's biggest headaches, traffic congestion. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.